The matron leaned in, all smiles masking discomfort. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am. We've had a few guest complaints." Sarah blinked. "Complaints?" He glanced at her arm, the visible burn scars she'd forgotten to cover tonight. "We're happy to pack your meal to go. I'm sure you understand." She didn't argue, just stood, adjusted her sleeve, and walked toward the exit with her takeout bag in hand. But she didn't notice the man in the back booth, dressed in formal military green, mid-toast with his wife. Until their eyes met. His hand froze mid-air. His face drained of color. He rose from the table without a word, following her out. Because the woman they just shamed? She once saved his life. Sarah Dawson had been looking forward to this evening for weeks. At 32, she'd learned not to expect much from life beyond her work as a trauma nurse at County General, but tonight felt different. She'd just been promoted to lead nurse in the emergency department, and for once, she had both the money and the energy to celebrate properly. She'd chosen Meridian, an upscale restaurant downtown that she'd walked past countless times but never entered. The kind of place with white tablecloths, wine lists that required actual thought, and prices that made her wince slightly even with her new salary. But tonight, she'd decided she deserved it. Sarah had spent an hour getting ready, choosing a simple black dress that she hoped would help her blend in. She'd applied makeup carefully, trying to cover the smaller scars on her neck and collarbone, though the burns on her left arm were too extensive to hide completely. She'd considered wearing long sleeves, but the October evening was warm, and she was tired of always hiding. The scars were 7 years old now, from her deployment as a Navy medic in Afghanistan. Most people who saw them assumed they were from a house fire or car accident. Sarah never corrected them. The truth was more complicated than most people wanted to hear. She'd made a reservation for 7:30 p.m., requesting a quiet table if possible. When she arrived, the hostess had looked her up and down with the kind of polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but led her to a small table near the back nonetheless. For the first 20 minutes, everything was perfect. The bread was warm, the wine was smooth, and Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: normalcy. She wasn't Nurse Dawson dealing with trauma after trauma. She wasn't the woman with the burned arm that people stared at in grocery stores. She was just someone enjoying a nice dinner. That's when she noticed the looks. It started subtly. A woman at the corner table whose gaze lingered a moment too long when Sarah reached for her water glass. A man dining alone who kept glancing over, his expression mixing curiosity with discomfort. Sarah had learned to recognize these looks over the years. She tried to ignore them, focusing on her meal. A perfectly cooked salmon with vegetables that probably cost more than she usually spent on groceries in a week, but the attention was building. She could feel it like a physical weight. A family with young children sat at the table next to hers. The 8-year-old boy stared openly at her arm until his mother noticed and whispered sharply for him to stop. The mother then spent the rest of the meal positioning herself to block her son's view, casting nervous glances in Sarah's direction. Sarah felt her appetite disappearing. She'd been through this before. The stares, the whispers, the way people seemed to think her scars were somehow contagious or inappropriate for public viewing. Usually, she could handle it. She'd developed thick skin over the years. But tonight, when she just wanted to feel normal, it hit harder than usual. She was considering asking for the check when the maitre d' approached her table. Marcus Winters had been working at Meridian for 3 years, and he prided himself on handling difficult situations with tact. He dealt with everything from drunk customers to celebrity tantrums, always maintaining the restaurant's reputation for discretion and service. Tonight, however, he was facing something different. 3 separate tables had complained about the woman dining alone. The complaints were coded in the polite language of expensive restaurants: concerns about ambiance, mentions of children being disturbed, suggestions that perhaps the establishment wasn't the right fit for all patrons. Marcus knew what they really meant. He'd seen the woman's scars, noticed the way other diners looked at her. He felt genuinely sorry for her, but he also had a business to run and other customers to consider. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am," he said, leaning down to speak quietly. "We've had a few guest complaints." Sarah set down her fork and looked up at him. "Complaints?" Marcus glanced at her arm, then back to her face. "We're happy to pack your meal to go. I'm sure you understand." For a moment, Sarah just stared at him. She understood perfectly. She understood that her scars made people uncomfortable. She understood that her presence was considered disruptive. She understood that no matter how much money she had or how politely she behaved, there would always be places where she wasn't welcome. "Of course," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. She didn't argue. She'd learned years ago that arguing only made things worse, drew more attention, created more of the scenes that people claimed to want to avoid. She simply nodded and waited while Marcus arranged for her meal to be boxed up. In the back corner booth, Colonel John Patterson was celebrating his 25th wedding anniversary with his wife, Linda. They'd chosen Meridian because it was where they'd had their first date when he'd returned from his second deployment, back when he was just a captain and she was still deciding whether she could handle being a military wife. John was mid-toast, raising his glass of wine and telling Linda how grateful he was for all the years she'd waited for him to come home, when he noticed the commotion near the center of the restaurant. A woman was standing at her table, looking resigned as the maitre d' spoke to her in hushed tones. Something about her posture, the way she held her shoulders, caught his attention. Then she turned slightly, and he saw her profile. The wineglass slipped from his hand, shattering on the table. "John!" Linda exclaimed, grabbing her napkin to soak up the spreading wine. "What's wrong?" But John wasn't listening. He was staring at the woman as she walked toward the exit, takeout bag in hand. 7 years fell away in an instant, and he was back in the desert, back in the worst moment of his life. The 15th of October, 2017. Forward Operating Base Chapman, Afghanistan. John had been a major then, leading a convoy inspection when the IED detonated. The blast had thrown him against a concrete wall, and when he'd regained consciousness, he was trapped under debris with shrapnel in his chest and blood pooling beneath him. He'd been certain he was going to die. The firefight was still going on around him, bullets ricocheting off the walls, and he could feel his strength fading with each breath. That's when she'd appeared. A Navy medic, barely visible through the smoke and dust, crawling toward him with her medical kit. She'd been caught in the blast too. Her left arm was burned, her uniform torn, but she'd kept moving. She'd reached him, assessed his injuries, and started working to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me," she'd said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "I'm going to get you out of here." The evacuation point was half a mile away. She'd fashioned a stretcher from debris and her own equipment, then dragged him across the compound while mortars fell around them. He'd drifted in and out of consciousness, but he remembered her voice, steady and reassuring, telling him about her plans to go to nursing school when she got back to the States. He tried to stay awake, tried to help somehow, but the blood loss was making him delirious. The last thing he remembered, before losing consciousness, was her pulling a photograph from her vest pocket. A boy in a baseball cap, maybe 6 years old, grinning at the camera. "My nephew," she'd said, noticing his gaze. "He's why I do this. Kids need adults who will fight for them." John had woken up 3 days later in a field hospital in Germany. The medic who'd saved him had already been transferred to another unit. He tried to find her, to thank her, but military bureaucracy and the chaos of wartime had made it impossible. All he'd known was her first name, Sarah. Now, 7 years later, she was walking out of a restaurant because her scars, the scars she'd gotten saving his life, made other people uncomfortable. "John, you're scaring me," Linda said, still trying to clean up the spilled wine. "What's happening?" John stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "That woman," he said, his voice hoarse. "I have to. I'll be right back." He didn't wait for Linda's response. He was already moving toward the exit, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since his last deployment. Sarah was standing at the curb, waiting for her rideshare, when she heard footsteps behind her. "Ma'am?" She turned to see a man in military dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons and medals. He was probably in his late 40s, with graying hair and the kind of bearing that came from years of command. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly. "Do I know you?" Sarah asked, confused. "Kandahar, 2017, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The 15th of October, IED explosion at the northeast compound. Sarah's breath caught. She'd worked on dozens of wounded soldiers during her deployment, but she remembered that day. The young major who'd been caught in the blast, the desperate crawl across the compound while the firefight continued around them. "You pulled me out," John continued, "half a mile to the evacuation point. I was bleeding out, and you saved my life." Sarah stared at him, memories flooding back. "You had a photo," she said slowly. "A little boy in a baseball cap." John's eyes filled with tears. "My son. He's 13 now. I got to watch him grow up because of you." They stood in silence for a moment, both processing the strange coincidence that had brought them together again. Sarah had never expected to see any of the soldiers she'd treated. The military didn't make it easy to maintain contact, and she'd learned not to get too attached to the people she helped. It was the only way to keep doing the work. "I tried to find you," John said. "After I recovered, I wanted to thank you, but..." "You don't need to thank me," Sarah interrupted. "I was just doing my job." "No," John said firmly. "What you did was above and beyond. You risked your life to save mine, and you got hurt doing it." He gestured toward her arm. "Those burns are mine to carry," Sarah finished. "They're not anyone else's problem." John's expression hardened. "What happened in there? Why did they ask you to leave?" Sarah shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Some people don't like looking at scars. It's not the first time." "That's not acceptable," John said, his voice rising. "That's not. No, absolutely not." Without another word, he turned and strode back toward the restaurant entrance. Sarah called after him, but he was already pushing through the doors. The dining room fell silent as John stormed back inside, his military bearing commanding attention. The maitre d' approached nervously, clearly unsure how to handle a uniformed officer who looked ready for battle. "Sir, is everything all right? Can I help you with? Which one of you told that woman to leave?" John's voice carried across the restaurant, and every conversation stopped. Marcus Winters felt his stomach drop. "Sir, I'm not sure what you mean. The woman with the scars on her arm. The one you just asked to take her meal to go because she made your customers uncomfortable." The restaurant was dead quiet now. Every patron was watching, some looking embarrassed, others curious about the unfolding drama. "Sir, we had several complaints," Marcus began. "That woman," John interrupted, his voice getting louder, "is a war hero. She's a Navy medic who saved my life in Afghanistan. While mortars were falling and men were dying, she crawled through enemy fire to reach me, then carried me half a mile to safety. She got those burns pulling wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles." The silence in the room was complete now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to listen. "She didn't ask for special treatment," John continued. "She didn't wear her uniform or her medals. She just wanted to eat dinner like any other customer. And you decided that her sacrifice, the visible proof that she put her life on the line for others, was too ugly for your establishment." Marcus's face was red with embarrassment. "Sir, I had no idea. You shouldn't need to know someone's story to treat them with basic human decency," John said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "But since you clearly need it spelled out for you, let me be clear. If you ever treat a veteran, or anyone else, this way again, I will make it my personal mission to ensure everyone knows what kind of establishment you're running here." He looked around the room, making eye contact with the diners who had complained about Sarah's presence. "And to the rest of you who were so uncomfortable with her appearance, you should be ashamed of yourselves. That woman is the reason I'm alive today. She's the reason I got to see my son grow up, the reason I got to celebrate my anniversary tonight. And you couldn't even let her eat her dinner in peace." The room remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. Where before there had been curiosity, now there was shame. An elderly woman at one of the corner tables stood up slowly. I was one of the people who complained," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "You didn't need to know," John replied, but his voice was gentler now. "You just needed to remember that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." John walked back outside to find Sarah still standing at the curb, her phone in her hand. "I canceled my ride," she said when she saw him. "I figured you might need backup in there." Despite everything, John smiled. "Still looking out for others, I see." "Old habits," Sarah said with a shrug. "Come back inside," John said. "Please, have dinner with my wife and me. Let me buy you the meal you should have been able to finish in the first place." Sarah hesitated. "I don't want to cause more trouble." "The only trouble would be if you don't come back in," John said. "Linda's been dying to meet you anyway. I've told her about the medic who saved my life more times than I can count." When they walked back into the restaurant, the atmosphere was completely different. The maitre d' approached immediately, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Ma'am, I owe you an enormous apology," Marcus said. "Your meal is on the house, of course, and I want to personally ensure that you're never treated this way again. In fact, I'd like to offer you a standing reservation here whenever you'd like to dine with us." Sarah nodded politely but didn't say anything. She'd heard apologies before, usually after someone learned about her military service. The apologies were nice, but they didn't change the initial reaction. John led her to his table, where Linda was waiting with tears in her eyes. "You're her," Linda said as soon as they sat down. "You're the medic. John talks about you all the time. He's been carrying guilt for years that he never got to thank you properly." "There's nothing to thank me for," Sarah said, but Linda shook her head. "There's everything to thank you for," Linda replied. "You gave me my husband back. You gave our son his father. You gave us our whole life together." As they shared dinner, Sarah's meal reheated and served properly this time. John told Linda the full story of that day in Afghanistan. Sarah filled in details she'd never shared with anyone about the fear she'd felt, the split-second decisions, the way she'd used her nephew's photo to stay focused on what mattered. "I heard they tried to give you a medal," John said as they finished their meal. Sarah nodded. "I didn't go to the ceremony. It felt wrong, somehow. Like I was being rewarded for doing what anyone would have done." "Anyone wouldn't have done it," Linda said firmly. "Most people would have looked for their own way out. You ran toward the danger." "I was trained to run toward danger," Sarah replied. "That's what medics do." "No," John said. "That's what heroes do, whether they wear the label or not." As they prepared to leave, John walked Sarah to her car. "I'm glad we found each other again," he said. "I know tonight didn't start well, but I'm grateful it ended this way." "Me too," Sarah said, and she meant it. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as the woman with the scars, but as the person who'd earned them doing something that mattered. "Stay in touch this time?" John asked, handing her his card. Sarah smiled. "I think I can manage that." As she drove home, Sarah thought about the evening. It hadn't been the quiet celebration she'd planned, but it had been something more important. It had been a reminder that her scars weren't just marks of trauma. They were proof of courage, evidence of a life lived in service to others. Some scars tell stories of pain, others tell stories of heroism. Tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah felt proud of hers.